Hello there and welcome to the show. Today we're diving into the trade and political tensions between Canada and Donald Trump during his presidency from 2017 to 2021. Now you might think Canada, the land of maple syrup and passive-aggressive apologies? What could possibly go wrong? Well, my friends, buckle up because when Donald Trump is involved, even the most innocuous relationship can turn into a geopolitical steel cage match. Over those 4 years, Trump took aim at Canada with the grace of a moose on roller skates, from trade disputes that would make a WTO negotiator break out in hives to personal insults that could curdle poutine. It was a wild ride. So grab a double-double, settle in, and let's unpack this dumpster fire of diplomacy, shall we? Our story begins with NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. For decades, it was the trade deal that dared not speak its name, whispered in hushed tones by economists and blamed for everything from factory closures to bad haircuts. Trump, never one to shy away from a good economic scare tactic, called NAFTA the worst trade deal maybe ever signed anywhere, but certainly ever signed in this country. He vowed to tear it up and replace it with something bigger, better, and more beautiful. Now, to be fair, NAFTA wasn't perfect. It had its share of flaws, but it also created millions of jobs and intertwined the U.S., Canadian, and Mexican economies more closely than a plate of nachos at a Super Bowl party. But Trump, with the subtlety of a bald eagle crashing through a window, insisted on renegotiating it, holding Canada and Mexico hostage with the threat of tariffs on things like cars and, well, more cars. After months of tense negotiations, threats and counter-threats, the three countries finally agreed on a new deal, the USMCA or the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Now, you might be thinking, that sounds awfully familiar, and you'd be right. The USMCA was essentially NAFTA with a fresh coat of paint and a new name that sounded like a regional airport. It made some modest changes, but the core remained the same. Of course, Trump declared it a huge victory and a historic breakthrough, because if there's one thing Trump loves more than a trade war, it's declaring victory, even if it's a victory over a problem he largely created himself. Now, you might think that with the USMCA signed, sealed, and delivered, things would calm down between Trump and Canada. But you'd be wrong. Remember that whole grace of a moose on roller skates thing? Yeah, that was about to become painfully clear. In 2018, Trump, citing that old chestnut national security, decided to slap tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, including those from Canada. Now, Canada is America's closest ally, its biggest trading partner, and let's face it, the nation most likely to help you hide a body after a particularly messy maple syrup heist. But none of that mattered to tariff man Trump. He went ahead with the tariffs, prompting Canada to retaliate with tariffs of its own on American goods, ranging from ketchup to toilet paper. The trade war was on, and it was about as fun as a root canal performed by a beaver with a rusty chisel. Canadian officials were furious, with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau calling the tariffs insulting and unacceptable. The tariffs hurt businesses and consumers on both sides of the border, driving up prices and disrupting supply chains. But Trump, ever the master negotiator, and by master negotiator I mean guy who starts a bidding war with himself on eBay, dug in his heels. As if the trade war wasn't enough, Trump also seemed to have a personal vendetta against Justin Trudeau. Maybe it was Trudeau's youthful good looks, his perfectly coiffed hair, or his ability to speak French without sounding like a malfunctioning GPS system. Whatever the reason, Trump repeatedly attacked Trudeau in public and private. He called Trudeau very dishonest and weak, and even went so far as to say that Trudeau doesn't like me. Now, I'm not a body language expert, but I'm pretty sure that when someone slaps tariffs on your country, calls you names, and then tries to undermine you on the world stage, it's a safe bet they're not sending you a fruit basket for Christmas. Trump's attacks on Trudeau baffled many observers. After all, Canada is a vital ally, a reliable trading partner, and a country that poses about as much of a threat to the United States as a basket of kittens. But Trump, never one to let facts get in the way of a good insult, continued to berate Trudeau, further straining relations between the two countries. It was like watching a family Thanksgiving dinner go off the rails after someone spiked the gravy with truth serum. Things came to a head at the 2018 G7 summit in Canada. The G7, for those of you lucky enough to have avoided international economic seminars, is a group of the world's wealthiest democracies. They get together every year to discuss important global issues like how much money they can squeeze out of developing countries and whether Crocs are an acceptable form of footwear for world leaders. Spoiler alert, they are not. The 2018 summit was supposed to be a relatively tame affair, with the usual discussions about trade, climate change, and how to get Angela Merkel to crack a smile. But Trump had other plans. He arrived late, skipped meetings, and spent most of his time tweeting insults at his fellow world leaders. He even got into a heated exchange with Justin Trudeau over, you guessed it, trade. After the summit, Trump refused to sign the joint communiqué, a largely symbolic document that outlines the leaders' shared priorities. He then took to Twitter to launch into a tirade against Trudeau, calling him meek and mild and accusing him of making false statements. It was a diplomatic debacle of epic proportions, leaving America's allies bewildered and its enemies gleeful. It was the kind of performance that makes you wonder if Trump's foreign policy was dictated by a magic 8-ball that only had two answers: tariff and insult. Now, you might think that with all the drama over trade and tariffs, immigration wouldn't be as much of a flashpoint between the US and Canada. After all, Canada is a vast, sparsely populated country with a long history of welcoming immigrants. And the US, well, let's just say that Trump's approach to immigration was about as welcoming as a porcupine in a bouncy castle. But despite their differences, immigration became yet another source of tension between the two countries. Trump's hardline policies, including the Muslim travel ban and the separation of families at the border, were met with widespread condemnation in Canada. Trudeau publicly criticized Trump's policies, calling them wrong and un-American. He even went so far as to tweet, "To those fleeing persecution, terror and war, Canadians will welcome you regardless of your faith. Diversity is our strength. Welcome to Canada." That tweet, which went viral, stood in stark contrast to Trump's rhetoric and policies. It also highlighted the growing ideological divide between the two countries, with Canada embracing diversity and inclusion while the US seemed to be retreating into isolationism and xenophobia. The immigration issue also had a very real impact on the ground. The number of asylum seekers crossing the U.S. Canada border illegally surged during Trump's presidency, as people fearing deportation from the US sought refuge in Canada. This influx strained resources and led to political headaches for Trudeau, who faced criticism from both sides of the aisle. Now, if there's one issue that highlights the chasm between Trump and Trudeau more than any other, it's climate change. Trudeau, a self-proclaimed environmentalist, has made tackling climate change a cornerstone of his domestic and foreign policy. He's implemented a carbon tax, invested in renewable energy, and pledged to meet Canada's commitments under the Paris Agreement. Trump, on the other hand, well, let's just say that his views on climate change are about as nuanced as a sledgehammer. He's called climate change a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese, rolled back environmental regulations, and pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement, much to the dismay of America's allies and the delight of coal executives everywhere. The two leaders' divergent views on climate change were on full display at international summits and meetings. Trudeau would urge action, while Trump would tout the virtues of beautiful, clean coal. It was like watching a debate between a scientist and a guy who gets all his information from Facebook memes. The Trump administration's environmental policies were met with widespread condemnation in Canada, where climate change is seen as an existential threat. Trudeau repeatedly criticized Trump's approach, calling it disappointing and irresponsible. But Trump, never one to let a little thing like scientific consensus get in the way of his agenda, continued to pursue policies that benefited fossil fuel companies at the expense of the environment. It was a stark reminder that, when it came to climate change, the US and Canada were two ships passing in the night, one heading towards a sustainable future, the other towards a coal-powered Titanic. Looking back, the Trump years were a tumultuous time in US-Canada relations. The trade wars, the personal insults, the policy disagreements, it was enough to make you wonder if these two countries were even friends anymore. Despite the challenges, the signing of the USMCA in 2018 helped restore some stability. but the tensions left a lasting impact on US-Canada relations during Trump's time in office. The relationship between these two neighbors, once considered one of the most stable and amicable in the world, had been tested like never before. Only time will tell if the wounds inflicted during those years will fully heal, or if the relationship will ever be the same again. But one thing's for sure, the next time an American president decides to pick a fight with Canada, they better be prepared for a fight, eh?